And thank you to all of you for coming out. As obviously it's nearly Halloween, the obvious choice of topic was the psychology of ghosts and hauntings. But you see from the subtitle there, the kind of perspective that you're going to be getting. I edited a magazine called The Skeptic for 10 years, so that's a bit of a clue to my perspective on these things. I was always sceptical about the paranormal, but the more I learned about psychology, the more sceptical I became. Anomalistic psychology, in case you haven't heard of it before, people basically often and quite understandably say, well, what on earth is anomalistic psychology? It is basically the psychology of weird shit. So anything from kind of alien abduction claims to people, past life regression, people who think they've seen ghosts, etc, etc, etc. I'm going to talk for about 45-50 minutes. It's a there is some real psychology in here, but it's also kind of fairly, hopefully, light-hearted and reasonably entertaining presentation. You can decide that at the end anyway. Quite a lot to get through. Brief introductory comments. I'll talk about hoaxes. I'm basically going to be concentrating on reasons people might think they have encountered a ghost when maybe there are more plausible alternative explanations. And that will include things like hoaxes, sincere misinterpretations of natural phenomena. I'm going to talk a little bit about seeing things that aren't there. Also, not seeing things that are there. The fallibility of memory. A little bit about objective evidence, or attempts to try and obtain objective evidence for ghosts. And a little comment on the media at the end. So, let's get stuck in. I still occasionally come across colleagues who kind of raise an eyebrow when they find out what kind of research what I'm interested in, the kind of research that I do, and the attitude is more or less, well, why are you interested in this stuff? I mean, we all know that ghosts don't exist. We all know that people are not really being abducted by aliens. We all know that there's no such thing as telepathy. Well, first of all, I don't think that's a properly open-minded scientific attitude. If I had to bet, I would bet that all of those statements are true. But I could be wrong, and maybe new evidence will come along in the future that will make me change my mind. I don't know, but we have to be open to that possibility. But I think more important from a psychological point of view is the fact that regardless of whether ghosts really do exist or they don't really exist, lots of people believe that they do. And furthermore, lots of people claim they've had personal experiences of ghostly encounters. So there's something there that psychologists ought to be able to comment on. And just to illustrate those points, this is opinion poll data, fairly typical from a Gallup poll of US adults in 2005. 37% said they believed in haunted houses. 32% said they believe in ghosts. That's quite interesting when you start to think about it, because it means that 5% believe in haunted houses that don't have ghosts in them. Go figure. A Murray poll of UK adults, again 40% believe in ghosts, and of those, over a third claim that they have personally experienced a ghost. So just to comment on that a little bit further, it shows that the levels of belief in ghosts are pretty high in modern Western societies. And it also shows that a sizable proportion of those people actually are saying, I believe in ghosts because I have encountered a ghost. But it also indicates that most people who say they believe in ghosts are not basing that upon personal experience. What are they basing it on? Well, they're probably basing it on accounts that they've heard from other people that they know and trust, maybe general media coverage, maybe stuff they've read in books, seen in films, but mostly it's not based upon direct personal experience. I'm going to be concentrating mainly on that 37% there, the people who think they have directly experienced a ghost. What might be the kind of psychological factors that are important there? Little joke for you there. Throw that in. The first question we should ask, I suppose, is it possible that the traditional interpretation of ghosts is actually the correct one? I.e., that when you die, something about you, whatever you want to call it, a soul, a spirit, consciousness, survives. and in certain circumstances can actually hang around on the earthly plane and still interact with living people. I am sceptical of that for lots of reasons, but just a couple of the main ones. Firstly, almost all of the evidence that's put forward to support the idea of ghosts is anecdotal. It's people saying, this happened to me, and then giving a description of what they often sincerely believe happened to them. The problem with anecdotal evidence is it's extremely unreliable. It's not actually worthless, but it's pretty close. We know so much about the unreliability of eyewitness testimony, etc., etc. I'll be talking about that quite a lot. That it's not really great evidence from a scientific point of view. But I think maybe more importantly, if you look at any society, at any point in history, anywhere on the planet, you will find belief in an afterlife, you'll find a belief in some form of life after death, and you'll find kind of accounts of reports of ghostly encounters. But what's interesting is they tend to vary quite considerably from one culture to another and from one point in time to another. Now, if ghosts really did exist, you want to presume that they are some kind of manifestation of an eternal, unchanging afterlife. We wouldn't expect to see the kind of levels of variability that we actually do see. The ancient Greeks' idea of ghosts is very different to our modern Western idea of ghosts. And even within, say, England, the ghosts in the time of the Reformation are very different to the kind of ghosts that we see and think about now, our own idea of ghosts. We wouldn't expect to see that if ghosts were real, reflecting some eternal afterlife. We would expect to see it if ghosts are actually a product of particular belief systems at particular points in time and geographically. Let's assume that ghosts are not spirits. What is going on? Well, sometimes skeptics go for the explanation that it's all made up, it's all hoaxes. It's all people either deliberately making stuff up or being the victims of hoaxes carried out by other people. Just to illustrate various kind of points of view, we consider poltergeists, for example. Poltergeist activity is when allegedly items are kind of thrown around without anybody appearing to touch them. Electrical devices switch on and off. There are strange noises, pools of water, all kinds of different disruption. And the traditional interpretation of what's going on there is that this is a noisy spirit. That's what poltergeist more or less translates as. So the idea is that someone has died and their spirit, for whatever reason, has not moved on to a better place and is hanging around on the earthly plane and causing trouble. And of course, a lot of films and horror films are based on that kind of notion of what poltergeist is. A lot of modern parapsychologists, they believe that this is a genuine paranormal phenomenon, but they don't believe it's caused by a spirit. What they point out is that typically in these cases, there tends to be one person who is always around when the disruption is happening. They refer to that person as the focus of the activity. And it's often, not always, but it's often a kind of troubled adolescent. And what these parapsychologists believe is that in some mysterious way, the inner psychological turmoil of that troubled individual is being externalized as psychokinetic energy, and that's what's causing all the disruption. But the source of the disruption is not the spirit of a dead person, it's a paranormal phenomenon that's being produced by a living person, okay? Albeit unintentionally. So they talk about RSPK, recurrent spontaneous psychokinesis. What boring old skeptics like me say is, well, you're right about who's causing the problem, you're just wrong about the way they're doing it. And basically argue that it's down to attention seeking, it's hoaxes. Now we know that is the explanation in some poltergeist cases. There have been a number of cases, well documented cases, where kids have been, oh I know what's happening, don't worry. This always happens. back to the PowerPoint. There have been a number of well-documented cases where children have been kind of secretly filmed and not realised that they've actually been caught on camera throwing the stuff around and then behaving as if they're terrified. But I can't for 1 minute claim that we know definitively that that's the case in all alleged poltergeist cases. We certainly don't. And typically, sceptical investigators are not actually welcome to investigate poltergeist cases because the people involved want it to be supernatural. They don't want some skeptic coming in and explaining it away as this, that or the other. Just to give you a couple of very famous examples of known hoaxes. This is the Fox sisters back in 1848 in Hydesville in New York State when Margaret and Katie Fox were just kids. They reported they could hear some strange rapping sounds. And I don't mean rapping in the sense of Eminem, I mean kind of knock. And they realised they could communicate with whatever it was that was making these sounds. So it's the beginning of the kind of idea of not once for yes, not twice for no. This is where seances originated. And through this method of communication, they figured out that it was the spirit of a peddler who had been murdered and buried on the site. This is their sister Leah, who had a good eye for a business opportunity. Initially, this kind of generated some local interest, and then it spread more widely. And other people also realised that they could also communicate with the spirits this way, and the seances became more and more elaborate, and probably fit more the idea that you have in your head of a typical seance. Leah basically made quite a lot of money by taking her sisters on tour. They ended up as kind of penniless alcoholics, which she did okay for herself. It was 40 years later that they admitted that the whole thing had been a schoolgirl prank that had just got out of hand. They were basically trying to scare their mum just for fun. They made the noises in various different ways, including they had the ability to crack their joints very loudly. And that was one of the ways that they would make these loud rapping sounds. This book here, The Amityville Horror, that topped the non-fiction bestseller lists when I was a teenager. Terrified me. Because it was a true story, except of course it wasn't. It's now widely recognised that the whole thing. Have any of you seen the film Amityville Horror? It's okay. There's loads of sequels. Well, the original book was all claimed to be absolutely true of this awful poltergeist case with people levitating and all kinds of other weird stuff happening. It's now generally accepted that the whole thing was just made up over a few bottles of wine, just as a money-making exercise. So, yeah, you can't believe everything that says a true story. Okay, but most people who believe that maybe their house is haunted or they've encountered a ghost are probably not either hoaxers or the victims of hoaxers. Another very common reason that people might believe that their house is haunted is because something gives them that suspicion in the first place. Some, to their mind, inexplicable event gives them the belief that their house is haunted. It might, for example, be an episode of sleep paralysis. I'll talk more about sleep paralysis because it's one of the things that we're very, very interested in. I'll leave that until later in the lecture. Or it might be finding that objects seem to be moving around on their own with no apparent explanation. Again, then maybe at the point where you think, right, I'm getting a bit freaked out by this, I'm going to mark the position of these ornaments on the mantelpiece, and you come down the next day and they all move 2 inches to the left. So that proves it then you have got a ghost. Well, maybe. There might be some other explanations. Maybe it's vibrations from passing traffic. Maybe there's some other explanation that you've not thought of. Once you've got the idea that your house is haunted, then even very mundane things become interpreted within that context. You can't find your car keys in the morning, the ghost has moved them. No, you just forgot where you put them. It happens to all of us, but no, you start interpreting even these kind of very mundane things within that wider context. There was a paper by the late Vic Tandy and Tony Lawrence in 1998 where they went through various documented cases where people had believed that their houses were haunted or properties were haunted, and investigation had revealed what the true causes actually were. Things like water hammer in pipes and radiators causing noises, electrical faults causing fires, phone calls and video problems, structural faults causing drafts, cold spots, damp spots and noises, seismic activity causing object movement or destruction and noises, and exotic organic phenomena like rats scratching or beetles ticking. I bet you didn't even know the beetles could tick, did you? Apparently some beetles can tick. I mean, my wife would be more freaked out by having rats in the loft than ghosts, I can promise you. The two main psychological factors that contribute to people believing they've had a ghostly encounter are context and belief. So, I mean, again, you'll know this yourselves. If you've ever stayed in a hotel or been shown around a stately home or something like this, and suddenly you're told, oh, by the way, this room's haunted, or, you know, it changes the way you feel about the place. Lange and Heron did a nice little study. There's two groups of participants who walk around a disused cinema, and just to note any anomalous experiences that they had. Any kind of cognitive, physiological, emotional, psychic and spiritual responses. And again, we're not talking here about people seeing full-form apparitions. We're talking about kind of more subtle things than that. People kind of saying, oh, you know, I feel a bit cold in there, there's a cold spot here, or I've got a very strong sense of presence, or hearing strange noises, you know, all that kind of stuff. So, one group were told, just all they were told was the site was about to be renovated. The other group were told that paranormal activity had been reported there. You can guess which group reported more anomalous sensations, the ones who had been told that paranormal activity had been reported there. Because they're primed, they're kind of on the lookout, they're noticing everything that's even a little bit kind of odd, they're registering it, whereas the other group just wouldn't, because they wouldn't even notice it. The second factor, as I said, belief in ghosts. This is Hampton Court Palace, reputedly one of the most haunted locations in England, and therefore the world, because we have the best ghosts anywhere. And Richard Wiseman did a nice study. They collected for a data from almost 700 people just walking around in Hampton Court Palace, and again asked them to note down any anomalous, odd sensations that they had. And they found that those who believed in ghosts reported more of those unusual experiences, the kind of thing I was just talking about, and they were more likely to attribute these experiences to ghostly intervention. Okay, so I want to say a little bit about seeing things, and for that matter hearing things that aren't actually there. If you say to someone who reports that they think they've seen a ghost, maybe you were just seeing things, obviously what you mean is seeing something that wasn't really there. And they know that means that what you're saying is maybe you were hallucinating. And people get very defensive about that. They think that what you're saying I'm crazy. And that's just not true. Hallucinations are much more common in the non-clinical population than is generally realised. We could all hallucinate under appropriate conditions. Hallucinations obviously can become a problem. Maybe the content of hallucinations is distressing and you're having them on a very regular basis, then maybe you do need psychiatric help. But an awful lot of people actually kind of hear voices, see things that other people don't see, and they live with it. They're just, you know, some of them even think of it as a gift. I think a lot of mediums are probably in that category. Another way in which you might see things that aren't there is the phenomenon of pareidolia, and I will say something more about that in a second. But for now, I want to say a little bit more about one particular hallucinatory experience that we're very interested in, something called sleep paralysis. Now, in its most basic form, it's very common. And what I mean by in its basic form is when you're half awake and half asleep and you realise that you can't move. And it typically lasts a few seconds and then you snap out of it. It's a little bit disconcerting, but it's kind of no big deal. There will be people in this room who have experienced sleep paralysis. Quick show of hands. Have you ever had it? Okay, you see a psychiatrist urgently. Joking. As I say, it was around about, I've got a big meta-analysis carried out by in America, Brian Sharpless, Estimated that around 8% of the general population report they've experienced sleep paralysis at least once in their lives. Interestingly, there are two groups who show higher levels, around about 30%, and those groups are psychiatric patients and students. And this actually makes sense when you start and think about it, because if you have the underlying susceptibility for sleep paralysis, you're much more likely to actually have an attack if your sleep pattern is disrupted. And two groups that are kind of notorious for not having very regular sleep patterns would be psychiatric patients and students. Now, as I said, in its most basic form, it's a bit disconcerting, but it's kind of no big deal. But you can get associated symptoms that can make it absolutely terrifying. Typically, these include things like a very strong sense of presence. You feel as if there's someone or something in the room with you, and whatever it is, they don't mean you any good at all. Bear in mind, you can't move, you're just lying there. The one part of your body you can move is your eyes. You can see you're in your bedroom, but you can't move. You might actually hallucinate. You might hear voices or footsteps or mechanical sounds. Or you might see lights moving around the room, or dark shadows or monstrous figures moving towards you. You might have tactile hallucinations. You might feel as if someone's holding you, or you might feel someone breathing on the back of your neck. And bear in mind, you can't move, so it's getting really, really freaky and scary now. There's difficulty breathing, there's often a sense of pressure on the chest, and it's felt very similar to a panic attack in many ways. And also intense fear. And you might say, well, isn't that just a reasonable reaction to all this stuff? Or maybe, but there is reason to believe that the amygdala, the part of the brain that deals with the fight or flight response, is actually overactivated during these episodes. If ever you talk about sleep paralysis, you are contractually obliged to show this picture. There's a great picture, it's from 1781 by Henry Fuseli, called The Nightmare. And it's just a beautiful depiction of sleep paralysis. You've got the horse peering through the drapes here, it's kind of weird looking horse. You've got the demon on her chest, so you've got a sense of pressure on the chest. And interestingly, if you do have the underlying susceptibility, you are much more likely to have an attack if you sleep on your back than in any other position. But to be honest, if you sleep in that position, you're asking for trouble. I mean, that's just silly. And 10 years later, she's learned absolutely nothing. She's still in the same position. One of the really interesting things about sleep paralysis is looking at the way that different cultures interpret it. I mean, how many of you had heard of sleep paralysis before I mentioned it? Quick show of hands. Quite a lot of you are very well informed audience, I can see that. But very often, in kind of more general audiences, a lot of people have never even heard of sleep paralysis. So that must include some people who are suffering from it. And there is this kind of taboo about talking about it in our society, because people know that if you tell someone else and they've never had an experience like that, they're going to look at you as though you're crazy, and they don't want that embarrassment. I got a letter from a 70-year-old woman quite recently saying that she'd basically been terrified. She was having sleep paralysis attacks, she didn't know what it was. She thought her house was haunted, and then she came across description of sleep paralysis on the internet, and basically she realised that's what it was. She went to her doctor and told her GP that she was suffering from sleep paralysis, and her doctor just said, never heard of it, just dismissed her. I was so angry. I mean, all he needed to do was like 2 minutes on Wikipedia. You can find out, yes, it's a real thing. There's a medical and scientific literature, and his ignorance. He made her feel very small and stupid. She'd plucked up the courage to actually go and tell the GP. And anyway, I sent her some papers and said, just next time you go, rub his nose in them. Anyway, but in other cultures, they often do have a label for it, and therefore they're much more open to talking about it, but typically they'll have some kind of supernatural interpretation of it, based on folklore and various other things. So there are literally dozens and dozens of different examples from around the world. Just to give you 2 or 3, in Newfoundland, they talk about the old hag who comes and sits on the sleeper's chest and suffocates them. In Japan, it's kanashibari, literally bound by iron. Again, nocturnal spirit attack. It's one of my favourites because it's so creepy in St. Lucia. It's Kokmar. And Kokmar There's the spirits of unbaptized children that crawl onto the sleeper's chest and throttle them. So do all sleep well tonight, won't you? Back in Europe in the Middle Ages, it was sex-crazed demons who would come and have their wicked way with you while you were asleep. The incubus was the male version. The word incubus literally translates as one who crushes. And the female version was the succubus. To be honest, I don't know which of the two of them is the more shock. It's very so again, all right, so that's sleep paralysis. I mean, we do know in general terms what causes it, by the way. And during the normal sleep cycle, you go through kind of this cycle that repeats throughout the night, about 90 minutes long, and within that cycle, you go through stage 1, stage 2, stage 3 sleep, your brain waves change, your heart rate, your breathing rate, and so on. Then you come back up through those stages and go into REM sleep, rapid eye movement sleep. And that's the phase of sleep that is typically associated with vivid dreams. When you're in REM sleep, the muscles of your body are actually paralysed, presumably to stop you acting out the actions of the dream. But something goes a little bit skew-with in these situations. And put it simply, it's as though your brain wakes up but your body doesn't. So you've got this interesting situation where you can't move because your body's still paralysed. You can see that you're in your bedroom, you feel like you're awake, you very, very much feels like you're awake, but you've got all this weird dream imagery coming through into normal consciousness. And the end result is one of these potentially terrifying episodes of sleep paralysis. Okay, if any of you have had it, we're doing this big survey with BBC Focus magazine that we're launching appropriately enough on Halloween. So if you've ever had that, or, wait for it, exploding head syndrome, it's a thing. We would love to hear from you, so look out for the links to that. Or even if you've not actually, because we also, for comparison purposes, we need people who've not had these weird experiences as well. So just fill in our survey, please. We'll be very grateful. Okay, pareidolia. Another situation in which people can see things, or think they're seeing things that aren't really there. This is based on the idea of top-down processing. As you will be aware, the general kind of approach of cognitive psychologists is that as we're interacting with the world around us, we've got two sources of information. We've got what's called bottom-up information, coming in through the senses, but sometimes that can be inherently ambiguous or degraded, and to make sense of it, we make use of top-down processing. What we already know about the way the world is, what we believe, what our expectations are. And these two, the top-down and the bottom-up, are interacting constantly, producing a mental model of the world and our place in it. And as I say, we're constantly revising that on the basis of new incoming information. If the bottom-up information is inherently ambiguous or degraded, then it means the role of top-down processing becomes relatively stronger. And so sometimes, to the extent that we end up seeing things and hearing things that aren't actually really there. One example of this is the phenomenon known as pareidolia, a type of illusion or misperception involving a vague or obscure stimulus being perceived as something clear and distinct. And what we often tend to see is, in visual randomness, is faces. Okay, we all had the experience of seeing a face in a cloud, or in the shape of a stain on the floor, or the grain of wood, and so on. And obviously it could explain why sometimes people think they've seen a face and it's actually just the shadows and the light and so on and so forth. Or just a few fairly light-hearted examples just to illustrate what I'm talking about. Here is a cloud that some people think looks like Marlon Brando. Okay, not impressed. Here's a more famous example. This is a cinnamon bun that some people think bears a striking resemblance to Mother Teresa. Now, I don't know if you can see that, so that's none or bun, the immaculate confection. If you can't see it, there's a nice little animation there to help you. It is actually quite a good likeness. But when Simmonds and Chabris first used this video in a study, back in 1999, the brilliant title, Gorillas in Our Midst, I love that, as opposed to Gorillas in the Mist. Anyway. About half, getting on for half the people who did the counting task do not see the gorilla. And that is a really counterintuitive finding. You think, surely something as odd and bizarre as that would capture your attention. But no, and eye movement studies have shown that people can be looking right at the gorilla and they just don't see it. It's a phenomenon known as inattentional blindness. You've probably already heard of it. It's generated a huge amount of research because obviously a lot of fatal accidents are caused by people not seeing things that are right there in their line of sight and they just don't register them. Now the sorry, I meant to show you this, but it's just the same thing. I'll show it to you because I've got the slide. It's the same thing basically. I've forgotten that I've still got the old day. If I had a measure of the personality dimension of absorption, if you score highly on the measure of absorption, you're the kind of person who, if you are watching a film or reading a book or doing a crossword puzzle, you completely shut out the outside world. You're completely absorbed in what you're doing. And although the received wisdom within the world of inattentional blindness research was that susceptibility to inattentional blindness doesn't correlate with any particular personality variables, we both thought intuitively you would think it would correlate with absorption. And I was intrigued because I knew from my general reading that absorption correlated with paranormal belief and reports of paranormal experience. So we thought, okay, let's do an experiment where we just look at all of that in a single study. So we did. We didn't use the gorilla video. We used a conceptually similar task. We had black and white letters bouncing around the screen. And halfway, people are told to count the number of times the white letters hit the edge of the screen. Halfway through, a big red cross moves slowly across the background. You can't miss it if you're not doing the counting task. If you are doing the counting task, about half of the people miss the red cross. So that was our gorilla. We published this in 2014. In our first experiment, we found that the inattentionally blind subjects did indeed score significantly higher on our measure of absorption and also on paranormal belief and experience. So we thought, that's interesting, let's see if we can replicate it. So we did. And in the second study, we also included a measure of working memory capacity, the kind of memory you'd use if you were trying to solve a complex puzzle where you have to hold some numbers in mind while you manipulate others, that kind of thing. And again, my wife had found this in a lot of her previous research. Inattentionally blind people tend to score lower than the non-inattentionally blind on working memory capacity. The idea would be that they're using all of their cognitive resources on the primary task, the thing they've actually been asked to do, and they've got nothing left over to pick up on what is actually an irrelevant stimulus. Now it's kind of quite interesting and kind of translating it back into the possible world life scenarios. And I often get faced by people who say, okay, Mr. Smarty Pants Skeptic, how do you explain what happened to me? And they will then give you their own paranormal anecdote. And sometimes, not always, but sometimes, there might be a really mundane explanation. Maybe that book didn't move on its own. Maybe there was someone else in the room with you and they moved the book. Oh, no, I'd have seen them if there were. Well, would you? People don't see a gorilla, you know? What it does illustrate is, surprise, surprise, I think you probably all knew this, eyewitness testimony is notoriously unreliable. There have been literally hundreds of studies for staged or actual crimes that have shown that people get all kinds of details wrong. So, this is important because typically, if we're dealing with kind of reports of ghosts, we're not dealing with the events, the experiences themselves, we're dealing with someone's report of them. How accurate actually are those reports? It might be slightly more surprising that even memory for very simple everyday stimuli, things that you have seen literally thousands of times in your life, can also be surprisingly unreliable. How is the 4 represented on clocks and watches with Roman numerals on them? Is it like this, I, or is it like this, IV? How many people think it's I? Quick show of hands. Nobody. How many people think it's IV? Presumably everybody. Well, I'm pleased to tell you, you're all wrong. On clocks and watches, but only on clocks and watches, the 4 is almost always represented like this. It's a very unusual way to do it. Presumably it's kind of in the interest of kind of balance and aesthetics and so on, but this is the way it is. There are a few exceptions. You don't need to email me about Big Ben. I already know. And what that illustrates is that, again, you knew this, memory does not work like a video camera. You couldn't kind of think to the back to the last time you saw a clock or a watch with Roman numerals on and zoom in on before and, oh yeah, I noticed that before. You can't do that, that's not how it works. Instead, it's top-down processing. You are answering the question in terms of what you think you must have seen. And in this case, you typically get it wrong. But belief, and what you believe about the way the world is, can influence your memory and your perception. There have been a few studies that have looked directly at memory for anomalous events. Richard Wiseman and colleagues did some research. I mean, it's interesting, the very first study ever, the very first systematic study of the unreliability of eyewitness testimony was carried out in the context of a faked seance. A guy called S.J. Davy, back in the Victorian era, when seances were all the rage, he'd been along to a few seances. Initially, he was totally convinced by what he saw, and then he learned that all of those effects could be achieved by trickery. And so he practiced the tricks himself and became very good at it, and he put on his own seance, and he invited people he knew to come and attend his seance and got them to write down an account of what they had experienced in as much detail and as accurately as possible. And what they basically found was that the accounts that were produced were so much of a distortion from what had actually happened that if you'd accepted them at face value, you would never have been able to explain how things were done. But the accounts themselves were inaccurate, very inaccurate. Richard Wiseman, there's a guy called Theodore Besterman who did similar kinds of experiments back in the 30s, and Richard has done a bit more recently. Eyewitness accounts for sensory paranormal phenomena, such as those that occur at seances, are very inaccurate. And also, it shows that people who believe in the paranormal are more susceptible to the power of suggestion. So if the medium says something like, oh, that candlestick's moving, then later on the believers are much more likely to report the candlestick moved, even though in fact it didn't. All kinds of stuff was said to happen during Victorian seances. You probably know generally what happened. People would sit around a table, typically all have their hands on the table. The sitters were told that they must not raise their hands from the table, they mustn't interfere with the medium in any way, shape or form, because if they did, the medium would die. In fact, there's no recorded that never actually happened, obviously, but it was a great way to make sure that nobody moved while you got to your tricks. And then all kinds of stuff would happen. Musical instruments would apparently float around playing themselves. There'd be materializations of hands and faces and sometimes entire spirit forms, and it was all very weird and lots of fun. But a lot of people did accept that it was for real, it was genuine paranormal stuff. Another study by Richard Wiseman, this time with the late Bob Morris, in 1995, they showed people what they call pseudo-psychic demonstrations. They were, in fact, conjuring tricks. But they were presented in a very neutral way. And like one example would be the kind of thing that Uri Geller made famous, metal bending, where you apparently just gently stroke a key or a spoon and it smoothly bends. What they found, not surprisingly, the believers in the paranormal were more likely to report they thought that the demonstration involved genuine paranormal forces, and no surprise there. But interestingly, they tended to be less accurate in remembering the important details of the demonstration. And what I mean by the important details is there are dozens of different ways of achieving the psychokinetic metal bending effect just using sleight of hand. But for somebody who knows a little bit about sleight of hand, there will probably be various giveaway clues as to how you achieved it. So for example, in this particular study, the way that the effect was achieved was that at one point during the demonstration, the straight object was swapped for a bent object, and then the bend was gradually revealed in such a way that it made it look like it was happening before your very eyes. For that to happen, the object has to go out of sight for a split second, and that's the kind of detail that the skeptics would notice, but the believers wouldn't. And again, it's not saying the believers are stupid, they're just watching it with a different attitude. The skeptics are watching it with a problem-solving mode on, okay? They want to figure out how it's done. The believers, believing it is possible, are just sitting back and enjoying the show. Okay. One of the things that we've got very interested in is this phenomenon known as memory conformity. If you have a situation where you have a single uncorroborated account from one eyewitness, you probably wouldn't give that as much weight as if you had numerous witnesses and they were all giving pretty much a similar account. And that's probably quite sensible. But one thing to bear in mind is that when people witness something unusual, like a crime, or a possible sighting of a UFO, or the Loch Ness Monster, or a ghost, they're going to discuss it with each other. And one person's account might influence another person's memory. So supposing you and I were walking around the banks of Loch Ness, and suddenly there's some splashing in the water, and you don't really see much, you just catch it out the corner of your eye, but I say, oh my God, did you see a head that just came up out of the water and went back down again? You might later on actually report you saw a head coming up out of the water and going back down again. My account has influenced your memory. I've got a colleague at Goldsmiths, Professor Fiona Gabbert, who kind of did a lot of the early research on memory conformity within a forensic context, where it's hugely important because one of the main reasons for wrongful convictions is faulty eyewitness testimony. We thought it would be interesting to look at in an anomalistic context. So we replicated an experiment by Richard Wiseman and Emma Greening, and we threw in a new twist. I'll describe their experiment first. How many people, or is there anybody who's not heard of Uri Geller? Oh, you're a very well-informed. Oh, hey, good. I worked one or two, right? A few. Okay. You're a very well-informed audience, though. You've all heard of sleep paralysis, and yeah, good. Uri Geller was someone who rose to fame in the 1970s, particularly in this country and then around the world, claiming that he had amazing psychic abilities. He kind of disappeared faded into obscurity, and he's recently kind of re-emerged just more as a kind of celebrity in his own right. He's not making such big claims. But the time he appeared in the 70s, I mean, I was totally taken in by him. I was a kind of teenager and I loved it. And there were scientists who were saying he was the real deal. He really did have these amazing abilities. I was so excited. But one of the things he claimed he could do all kinds of things, read minds, tell you the contents of sealed envelopes, all kinds of stuff. But the main thing that people associated with him was this thing that he would do where he would apparently bend spoons or forks just by gently touching them, and apparently they just go, ugh. So pretty amazing stuff. In fact, there was a story in the news today, apparently he scratched his neck and his head fell off. That's the clean version of the joke. Just saying. Anyway, a lot of people who saw Uri Geller doing this trick, particularly conjurers, just said, well, it's just sleight of hand, it's just a trick, it's not even a very good trick. And I know I've got a lot of friends who are conjurers now, and when they do it, it looks exactly the same. And as they say, if Uri is doing it using psychic powers, he's doing it the hard way, because it looks exactly the same when you do it as a trick. But there are some people who say, no, it can't be a trick, because I've seen him do it, and after he had finished bending the spoon, or the fork, or whatever it was, he put it down on the table, and he carried on bending, and he wasn't even touching it. Now, these days you can actually buy, from magic shops, gimmicked forks and spoons that will actually do that. But back in the day you couldn't. So, what was going on here? Well, people like Richard Wiseman, who's he's a conjurer as well as a psychologist, they know about the power of suggestion. So what Richard and Emma did in this study, they showed a video of an alleged psychic doing a spot of psychokinetic metal bending, and the interesting part comes after the metal has been, the key in this case has been bent using sleight of hand. It's put down on the table and there's a nice close-up shot. And in one condition, the participants hear the psychic say, if you look closely, you'll see it's still bending. The other condition is identical, except that you don't get that suggestion. Of those who get the suggestion, 40% report that they think the key carries on bending. Without the suggestion, virtually nobody does. The key does not carry on bending. So it's a really big effect, a really simple manipulation, and it shows the power of suggestion. Richard found that in 2 studies. We replicated it using the same video that he had used. We found the believers in the paranormal were more susceptible to the suggestion, but we also threw in a memory conformity element. We had people watching in pairs. And what the real participants didn't know was that the other person in the pair was a confederate, a stooge working with us. We'd been instructed to either say, the idea was to watch it together, then discuss it, and then report back independently what they'd seen. And the stooge was either instructed to report, to say it did carry on bending, or no, it didn't carry on bending during those discussions. And what we found was that we got to levels of 60% of people, those who'd had the suggestion from the psychic and then the reinforcement from the co-witness, 60% of those reported that the key carried on bending. It absolutely doesn't. Okay, so people can see things happening that aren't actually really happening. All the things I've talked about so far are all things that are basically in people's heads. Perception, memory, blah, 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 blah. The holy grail for paranormal researchers is getting some objective evidence. So all these paranormal investigation groups that you see on the telly, if you watch that kind of crap, they all have loads and loads of equipment, EMF meters, infrared cameras, camcorders, digital cameras, thermometers, EVP recorders, motion detectors, absolutely everything, because they want it to look like they are doing science. And they're really not. They want it to look that way. I've not got time to go through this whole list, obviously, so I'll make a couple of comments. First of all, on photography, really, really interesting. The history of photography is intimately intertwined with the history of paranormal investigation, right back from the very early days. So what looks to us like a very obvious double exposure, back in the day, when photography was new and the general public just didn't understand it, photography itself was such a mysterious process, that could be easily passed off as a spirit photograph. And there were photographers back in the Victorian heyday who specialised in spirit photography. You would go along, have your portrait done with the spirit of your dearly departed granddad benignly looking on, smiling on behind you. And there were lots of them who ended up in court being prosecuted as frauds. Quite right too. Bringing us back up to date, if you go on a ghost watch now with your dinky little digital camera, or just use your phone for that matter, very often people get these kind of things. Anybody know what that is? It's an orb, yes. These orbs appear in a lot of these photographs. And the idea, I don't know where it came from, is that this is spirit energy that's not yet coalesced into a fully formed ghost. Now, I don't know where the idea came from, but you can see why it's caught on. Because if you've ever been on a ghost watch, you spend hours and hours and hours in somewhere dark and dirty and cold, and typically nothing happens. These days, when you go down to the pub the next night and you've got your photographs, you can guarantee you're going to have loads and loads of orbs, because what the people who make the cameras say is, no, it's not spirit energy, it's a speck of dust that's been caught in the flash and it's out of focus. So you're guaranteed you're going to have loads and loads of orbs in your photos. So there was paranormal activity there, you know, even if nothing very exciting happened. Anyway, I'll say nothing more about that. Who's heard of the electronic voice phenomenon? Hey, the EVP. This is another thing that is very common with paranormal investigators. They believe if you take a recording device along and leave it in record mode, or alternatively if you just set a radio between stations, you can actually record spirit voices. Now there are loads of websites you can go to where you can listen to examples of this stuff, and one thing that strikes you is typically you can't quite make out what the message is until someone tells you, and then you listen to it again and think, oh yeah, maybe it is saying that. Yeah. The skeptics say, varies into possible explanations. I mean, one explanation is just that people have sometimes inadvertently recorded real voices. I did a daytime TV thing a couple of years back where the paranormal investigator was proudly playing his EVP, and there's no doubt at all it was someone singing Celine Dion songs, and it was terrifying. But I just don't think it was a ghost, that's all. Sometimes I think it's not even speech at all, it's just kind of random speech-like noises. But the point again is that you have to bring in the top-down processing before you can actually hear what it is. Once you know what it is and you've got the expectation, then those vague, ambiguous sounds do sound like something. So here are some actual spirit voices for your delectation. Your task is to tell me what they're saying. These are taken from various sites on the internet. So what's this spirit saying? And they're typically like that, very poor quality, very short. So I'll play it again. Any offers? It's a good try. According to the website, it's The Coward. Okay? So I will now play it again and see if you can hear it as The Coward. Yeah, kind of. Yeah. Here's another one. Now people do get this one. Think somebody said it, yeah?
I'm sorry.
We're sorry you've gone to the website, so play that one now you know what it is. Yeah, maybe. Now this one I think possibly is a genuine ghost. This one's a bit spooky, so prepare yourselves. Any offers? Say it again. Get out, get out, get out of my house. I think it's the ghost getting pissed off with the paranormal investigators. That's my theory. So I'll play it again now you know what it is. Yeah. Just going to give you one more example. This one's a bit tricky, and so I usually try and help people by saying, what would you expect a ghost to say? And there's usually at least one joker in the audience who goes, woo. It's not woo, it's not woo. But what would you expect a ghost to say? Try again. Any offers? What would you expect a ghost to say? Come on. No? Oh, it's obvious. Come on, what's the ghost going to say? Come and find the cave. Come on, guys. Right, here we go. Ready? Except, I am lying to you, because according to the website we nicked this from, they say it says someone's in the way. Now, I can't hear it as someone's in the way anymore. I always hear it as come and find the cave. You see if you can hear it as someone's in the way. No, it's come and find the cave. It's definitely come and find the cave. Okay, so I'm nearly finished now. So let's say a little bit about amnesia. For my sins, I have taken part in some really, really dreadful TV programmes, including a series on ITV called Haunted Homes, where I was basically the professional killjoy. I was the skeptic on the team. The star of the show was our psychic, and we also had our paranormal investigator with all his kit and so on and so forth. And I find myself sitting in these supposedly haunted rooms and all the lights out, night cameras all on my own, kind of, thinking, I used to have a proper job. and then, why am I doing this? And then I'd remember, oh, I know, they pay me. That's why I'm doing it. But they were actually quite fun. They were great fun to do, to be honest. And they were also quite an insight into the kind of lay psychology of what's often going on in these situations. They learned very, very early that if you have the skeptic around too much, it's a disaster. So you're all sitting there in the dark with the night cameras and there's a noise. What was that? And you go, I think it's just the central heating cooling down. The atmosphere. Whereas they realised, so they exiled me. I was outside in a Winnebago watching all of the action on remote screens, and then they'd allow me to go into 20 minutes at the end of the night. They had all the fun inside. But our psychic was really good at actually psyching people up. So in that same situation, if it was, what was that noise? And she'd say, yes, can you see some lights over there in the corner? And what was that? And she'd psych it up and psych it up and psych it up. And people get absolutely terrified because these were people who genuinely believed that their houses were haunted. Now usually it was private houses or flats where people lived. But there's one programme, and the reason I'm concentrating on this one, it was the only time ever that all of this equipment actually recorded something objectively. Ooh, yes. On every other programme, it was all in people's heads, and because nobody in our team, including our psychic, ever faked anyone, certainly never faked anything in the sense of throwing spoons or anything like that, basically we didn't get a third series. I mean, not much was happening. It's not great television. But here's a clip from, this is the one programme which was from a radio station rather than a house. Radio Beacon in the Midlands, which people who worked there believed was haunted. They'd heard various things. One of the couple of things I heard, that claimed they'd heard children's voices singing Ring a Ring a Roses, and also that sometimes they would hear a ghostly sneeze. So the format was always the same. Before we arrived, they'd get them to keep a video diary to see if they could record anything themselves. So this first clip is while they're doing the video diary. They're out, it's in the dark, it's all been filled with night cameras. And the sneezing is one of the symptoms. In fact, it's a myth. There isn't any evidence to support that, but a lot of people do believe that, and he's just made that connection and it's freaked him out a bit. Anyway, the next clip is from, I mean, you can see there, although you couldn't actually hear any sneeze in the recording, they did both seem to turn around at the same time. They did hear something. This is from the actual vigil, as they called it. I wasn't in the room at the time, I wasn't in the place. At the very beginning of this clip, you will hear what sounds like a sneeze, and then they go to investigate to see if they can figure out where it's coming from. As I said, Mark, our paranormal investigator, he'd had all his equipment out, so he had his EVP recorder, so he'd actually recorded the sneeze. So obviously the next day, they are going to confront the smart-ass skeptic with the evidence. So this is the next clip of me making a few comments. We performed a public service. We got rid of your ghost for you. So the next night, well, the second night there, our psychic would do this ridiculous kind of cod Latin ritual with loads of candles everywhere. I mean, it looked fantastic, you know, on camera, but it's complete nonsense. And she would make contact with the spirit. She would find out why the spirit hadn't moved on, and then when she had resolved that, a portal would open and the spirit would move on to a better place. And I mean, obviously none of the rest of us ever saw this, but we believed her. Anyway, just before we were going to do this ritual, I popped into the loo on the landing where the sneeze had been recorded, and as I came out of the cubicle, our paranormal investigator was there with a very disgruntled look on his face. He's pointing at the wall. I thought, oh, what's it going to be? Ectoplasmic snot? Anyway, looked to where he's pointing, and there on the wall was an automatic air freshener. So we hung around a little bit, and sure enough, that was the noise. No question about it. So we did an interview to camera the next day to explain that we know that it's not a ghostly sneeze, it's the air freshener. So the next clip I'd like to show you is us explaining to camera all about that, but unfortunately they didn't have enough space in the programme to include our explanation. Yeah, would you believe it? No. So anyway, lots of other evidence put forward for life after death, mediumship, reincarnation, Ouija boards, dowsing, near-death experiences. They're all topics for other talks, so thank you for listening.